These pictures show a rebel base recaptured by the army in the western city of Zawiya. There are reports that tank shelling of the city on Monday has been the fiercest so far. That's despite earlier claims the military had taken full control.
Today at 10:30, the pro-Gaddafi forces attacked the town center. They used around 20 tanks and several cannons. They fired randomly and in all directions, and today's attacks were the most intense so far.
Rebels are regrouping in towns in the east of the country. The military and pro-Gaddafi forces have, at least for the time being, halted their advance to the Libyan leader's hometown and stronghold of Sirte. A report on Libyan state TV showed pictures, it said, were of rebel fighters killed in battle. The man on the microphone describes the men as rats serving a foreign agenda. These pictures have emerged purportedly showing a battle on Sunday in the town of Misrata, about 100 kilometers east of Tripoli. The amateur cameraman describes what he says is the blood of mercenaries. He says the post office was bombed by fighter jets. Gaddafi has again blamed the foreign media for distorting facts.
We don't wonder who is behind the foreign media and what their interests are. We think of them as channels conspiring and twisting the facts intentionally. I do not know the aim of these channels and who benefits from this.
As his propaganda campaign continues, he still seems almost oblivious to the increasing amount of civilians injured and killed. These images of wounded children were reportedly filmed in a hospital in Misrata. It's impossible to know exactly how many civilians have been killed and wounded so far, but a break in the military standoff will bring yet more intense fighting, and whatever that figure actually is sure to steeply rise. Charles Stratford, Al Jazeera.
Well, Jackie Rowland is in AlJazeera with more on the situation in Libya.
Well, at the moment, the most intense fighting in this particular area is focused on the town of Bin Jawad, which is less than 200 kilometers away from Gaddafi's stronghold of Sirte. Now, the rebels had been advancing towards Bin Jawad, but it's clear that they've been encountering extremely strong resistance from the Gaddafi forces. Rebels returning from the front line have spoken of Gaddafi forces emptying the town of civilians and also using heavy weapons against the rebels. Disproportionate force was how one person described it to me. It seems quite clear that the Gaddafi forces have drawn a line in the sand. They cannot allow the rebels to run the risk of getting any closer to Sirte. Sirte, Gaddafi's stronghold, important for two key reasons. Firstly, because it is the base of Gaddafi's tribe, the people who are most loyal to him. And secondly, because there's an important military base at Sirte, where Gaddafi has a lot of his most heavy weaponry. The government forces cannot afford to allow this kind of machinery, this kind of equipment to get into the rebels' hands.
That's Jackie Rowland from AlJazeera. Meanwhile, international concern is heightening as Gaddafi's forces make ground. The French and British missions to the United Nations are working on a draft resolution that would lead to the creation of a no-fly zone over Libya, while the U.S. government spokesman, meanwhile, said it was still considering a military response. Lawrence Lee reports on the international community's options and worries.
If the uprising began because of the death of fear, it's the fear of death that's now holding it back. The opposition fighters have said repeatedly that they're not as worried by Gaddafi's foot soldiers as they are by his jets and helicopters. All the same, though, the fact that Gaddafi's forces have now retaken the town of Zawiya shows that on the ground too, over time, the regime has the capacity to wear resistance down. It all presents a major problem for the international community. Most of the world may have decided that Gaddafi's time is up, but the longer this goes on, the more entrenched he's becoming. Hence the increasingly urgent calls for military intervention.
We've got NATO, as we speak, consulting in Brussels around a wide range of potential options, including potential military options, in response to the violence that continues to take place inside of Libya.
Option one, no-fly zones. If the US and others are worried about the logistics and how they might do it, it's also worth remembering that no-fly zones worked only partly in Iraq and quite ineffectively in the Balkans, where Slobodan Milosevic's army was still able to mount effective artillery attacks on civilians. Option two, arming the uprising and presumably training them as well, since many of them don't have much idea about how to use their new weapons. While in many ways it's much less complicated than no-fly zones, it's obvious that the concern in places like Washington is where all those weapons might end up.
Many of the al-Qaeda activists in Afghanistan and later in Iraq came from Libya and came from eastern Libya, which is now the so-called free area of Libya. So, I mean, there is a lot of moving parts to this.
In the end, the good news for organisations like NATO or powers like the US is that for once there's little debate as to whether they're doing the right thing by offering to get involved. Unfortunately, the longer it takes for them to decide what to do, the more entrenched Gaddafi's becoming. Lawrence Lee, Al Jazeera.
Well, joining me now in the studio is Tariq Youssef. He's a Libyan from Benghazi, and he's also the founding dean of the Dubai School of Government. Thank you for your time on Al Jazeera, Tariq. Let's just start out with the latest news that we have is that the Muammar Gaddafi has sent a representative to the opposition council to open negotiations on him stepping down. What do you think is behind this move? Is he putting feelers out to see what type of exit strategy may be available to him right now?
Possibly. Testing the resolve of the council. He's also put out a couple of prime ministers on TV from the city of Benghazi, former prime ministers, speaking to the people of Benghazi. Again, designed to send a message that Gaddafi is possibly open to talking. Let's sit down, let's meet, let's negotiate. No detailed offer has been submitted. So all that we've seen so far are efforts possibly to get a sense of the resolve of the council, perhaps see if there is any divisions within the council.
We must emphasize also, Tariq, that state television, Libyan state television, is denying that any meeting has happened, but a spokesman for the opposition is saying that contact has indeed been made. Should the opposition National Council at this point accept any such offer if it were made by Gaddafi or his envoy?
As they reacted, and rather swiftly, they rejected the idea of any sort of negotiations at this point. And they're right to do so, because over the last 42 years, Gaddafi has used this tactic of maneuvering, sending trial balloons to test both the strategy, the parameters, and the resolve of the other side. Until he comes out and puts this offer on the table and speaks to the Libyan people and the council, I think anything at this point is probably premature and just essentially designed to send a message that he's willing perhaps to talk. He's got the interest of the Libyan people at heart. He's not interested in bloodshed. Right at the moment when he's also sending these messages, the city of Misrata and Zawiya continue to be bombarded. So I think the Libyan National Council is right to reject any attempt to break their ranks or to test their resolve at this moment, and to stick to their basic demand that the only negotiations that are relevant are negotiations that are serious and over his departure and the parameters of that exit from Libya, as opposed to anything else.
But there could be a case to be made for Gaddafi's exit at this point, if only it would mean an end to the humanitarian situation and the crisis that we see going on in the country.
I think not only Libyans and the Libyan National Council, but the whole world would favor an exit plan for Gaddafi that would avoid further bloodshed, that will prevent battles